He stood over a plant that produced fertilizer while the market sold bags. Its roots went meters into the ground and brought hidden minerals back into the light. British explorers once believed the crop would help feed the devastated post-war world. They selected a sterile variety that was so productive that gardeners treated it as a fertility machine. He asked for no plant, no shipping, no annual purchases after rooting. Then the world turned to brightly colored packages, fast work, and laboratory certainty. After that, one safety scare helped bury the plant's garden reputation. The living tool became a suspicious herb, and most manufacturers stopped asking about the lost one. But the old trials, the old cuttings, and the old gardeners never completely disappeared. This story reveals who created Bocking 14 and why its return is important now. Bocking 14 comfrey is not just another green bed in the garden. It is a living engine. Its leaves shoot upward every spring, thick and wide, fed by a taproot that sinks 3 meters into the ground. While most crops scratch the surface in search of nutrients, this plant drills downward, reaching mineral veins untouched by shallow roots. Potassium, calcium, nitrogen, and phosphorus are extracted from the deep subsoil and loaded into each leaf. This plant is designed for abundance. Once rooted, Bocking 14 can be cut back to the ground 4 to 5 times per season. Wait just 4 weeks after harvest and the area is lush again, ready for the next cycle. In one growing season, up to 100 tons of leaf biomass can be produced per acre, more than almost any other field crop. This is not a typo or a theoretical maximum. British tests in the 60s and 70s measured this year after year, even on poor soils. Each leaf cut represents a concentrated package of nutrients. The numbers are staggering: 2 to 3% nitrogen, up to 7% potassium, far superior to traditional manure. Lay these leaves down as mulch, and they will disappear into the soil in just 2 days. Low fiber content means rapid decomposition, releasing mineral cargo almost instantly. Where other green fertilizers take weeks to break down, comfrey mulch turns into a black soil layer in less than 48 hours. The cycle is repeated after each harvest without annual replanting, without fertilizing, without plowing. Each plant comes back stronger, its root system tunneling deeper, loosening the clay and improving drainage. In 20 years, one patch of comfrey can transform abandoned soil into rich, living soil. It's not just a plant. It's a self-renewing nutrient mine. Its taproot acts like a living drill, lifting up supplies that would otherwise remain blocked far beyond the reach of vegetables and grains. The leaves, when cut and thrown, act like a conveyor belt, cycling these minerals to the surface over and over again. For anyone seeking true locked-in fertility, comfrey offers a blueprint that's hard to beat. But a plant of such strength does not spread by seeds. Bocking 14 is a sterile hybrid bred to stay put without being invasive, without weed taking over. Lawrence Hills did not look like a revolutionary. In 1954, he was a young British gardener with a head full of post-war worries. Empty shelves, tired soil, and the feeling that the world's food supply was always one bad season away from disaster. He saw in comfrey what others had missed, a plant that could transform barren land into abundance if only someone could tame it. That year, Hills founded the Henry Doubleday Exploring Association in a rented cottage in Bocking, Essex. The mission was simple but radical: prove with hard numbers and field trials that comfrey could feed people and livestock without chemicals or imported manure. The challenge was as much about control as abundance. Wild comfrey was notorious for spreading by seed, invading fields and hedgerows. Hills knew that no farmer would trust a plant that could take over the land, so he decided to create a version that would stay put, a comfrey that could be controlled rather than feared. Over the next few years, he collected varieties of comfrey across Britain, digging up roots from old gardens and abandoned farms. By 1958, he had secured a 3/4-acre plot of land in Bocking, paying only £10 a year in rent. Hills began growing 21 different varieties side by side on rented land. The work was slow, dirty, and often lonely, and he lived next to the experimental site, tending the comfrey rows through rain and drought, recording every scrap of data. He crossed Russian comfrey, known for its vigor, with common comfrey, looking for a plant that would not set seed. It took years of breeding and merciless selection, but by the early 60s, one strain stood out. Bocking 14 was sterile, did not produce viable seeds, and showed stubborn resistance to rust and disease. Most importantly, it produced the highest nutrient content, especially potassium, of any variety tested. Hills's notebooks filled with yield charts and mineral analyses. He tracked regrowth rates, cutting weights, and the effects of different soils, and early members of the association, most of them ordinary gardeners, donated pennies and pounds to support the trials. Some sent letters describing their own experiments with comfrey, echoing Hill's belief that everyone should grow it, no matter how little. By the mid-60s, the Bocking 14 was ready for the wider world. Hills did not patent his discovery or protect it as a trade secret. Instead, he sent root cuttings to anyone who asked, gardeners, smallholders, even foreign experimenters hoping to restore depleted soils. The association's comfrey trials became a quiet beacon for the organic movement. Hills's work was not about theory, but about proof. He wanted to show that a farmer, armed with only a shovel and a plot of land, could unlock fertility rivaling the best manure. In doing so, he did not risk the weeds exploding. Bocking 14 was the answer, a plant that stayed where you planted it, propagated only by root division, and produced a steady crop of nutrient-rich leaves year after year. For Hills, this was not just a botanical breakthrough, it was a plan for sustainability, a way to feed the world from the bottom up, one root at a time, and the philosophy of "we are observers, not believers" guided every experiment. The association grew from donations from ordinary people who believed that science could confirm the ancient wisdom about living soil. Each cutting sent carried not only a plant, but also the idea of independence from purchased fertility. Laboratory analysis leaves no room for doubt about the superiority of comfrey. Fresh leaves of Bocking 14 show 2 to 3% nitrogen, about 1% phosphorus, and a potassium range that goes up to 7%. That last number, potassium, is what makes comfrey a standout among fertilizers. For fruit-bearing plants, potassium is the key to big, sweet harvests, and comfrey supplies more of it than almost any manure or green crop. Side-by-side manure rarely exceeds 1.5% potassium, while comfrey leaves can quadruple that figure. It's not just the essential nutrients, though. The low fiber content of comfrey means these nutrients are unlocked almost instantly. Throw a pile of leaves onto a compost pile, and within hours the pile will heat up, sometimes by 10 or even 15 degrees. Microbes swarm through fresh green tissue, decomposing it so quickly that even a stagnant, cold compost pile can come back to life. Gardeners call comfrey a compost activator for a reason. Where straw or grass clippings can take weeks to decompose, the soft, protein-rich leaves of comfrey disappear in days. They feed the soil and every organism in it at an unprecedented rate. Liquid fertilizers tell the same story of homemade superiority. Soak comfrey leaves in water, and you get a dark, foul-smelling concoction. Comfrey tea, richer in potassium than many commercial tomato fertilizers. Tests show that a typical batch contains about 2% nitrogen, 1% phosphorus, and 3% potassium. These performance match or exceed the synthetic blue crystals sold in garden centers. The difference is in the source. Comfrey tea is brewed from a plant you cut for free, rather than from a bag you buy over and over again. Every metric, every test, every bucket of rotting leaves points in the same direction. Comfrey doesn't just compete with chemical fertilizers, it outperforms them for the nutrients that are most important to food crops. This is a fact that the fertilizer industry could not ignore in the mid-20th century. Moreover, historical and modern testing shows that home-based comfrey nutrition can be extremely effective. However, the strength of the nutrients varies depending on location and preparation method, adding realism to the old promises. Mid-century agriculture was embraced by a new promise: factory shortcuts. Synthetic fertilizers arrived in colorful packages, marked with numbers and claims of easy abundance. The message was everywhere. On billboards, in glossy magazines, even in government brochures. Nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, measured to the gram, ready to be scattered in minutes. No digging, no dragging, no waiting for the leaves to rot. In the time required to sharpen the sickle, the gardener could finish feeding an entire row with 1 spoonful of blue powder. The numbers told their own story. The Haber-Bosch process, invented in the early 20th century, could convert air into ammonia on an industrial scale, with massive energy costs, but with harvests that promised to feed millions. By the 60s, the chemistry was packaged as a convenience, with consulting services and trade groups hammering the distinction into people's heads. Why spend an hour cutting and carrying comfrey when you can finish fertilizing in 5 minutes with a synthetic mixture? The math was simple and favored the package, and the labor of managing a living fertility plant was quietly reimagined as old-fashioned. In 2001, the U.S. Food and Drug Administration drew a hard line. Comfrey supplements have been pulled from shelves labeled as containing pyrrolizidine alkaloids, compounds linked to liver damage if ingested. The agency's warnings focused on teas, capsules, and tonics, not the plant in the ground or its use as mulch. But the headlines didn't make that distinction. Comfrey's name ended up on consumer warning lists, and the word toxic started to stick. In the public consciousness, a plant once promoted as a garden ally has become a danger to be avoided. Garden centers, already wary of liability, chose the path of least resistance, and comfrey disappeared from catalogs and nurseries. Not because it was poisoning gardens, but because retailers were unwilling to explain the difference between a banned additive and a perfectly safe plant fertilizer. There were no laws against growing comfrey, no fines for using its leaves on tomatoes. Still, the effect was chilling. A plant that had been a quiet favorite of organic growers suddenly became radioactive in the eyes of the mainstream market. The science behind the panic is real, but in the soil, the same compounds are broken down by microbes and diluted by the environment. No regulatory agency has ever banned comfrey as a fertilizer, and there is no evidence that using it as mulch or compost poses a risk to people or crops. The real sacrifice was his reputation. Comfrey's fall from a height had less to do with what he was doing in the garden, more in common with a wave of regulatory fear that has swept away nuance. For many years, the plant survived only among die-hard organic gardeners and permaculture circles, quietly passed down as root cuttings and advice by word of mouth. The rest of the gardening world has moved on, leaving the old ally of soil in the shadows of oblivion. The distinction between ingesting comfrey and using it in the garden should have been key, but the public has stopped separating medicine from mulch. One regulatory event aimed at ingestion changed public perception of the entire plant. Structurally, this was the right place for a pivot about how reputations die when fear spreads beyond regulation itself. Pyrrolizidine alkaloids are dangerous if ingested in quantities, especially from roots or concentrated extracts. However, comfrey leaves used as mulch or tea contain less than 1/10 of the alkaloids found in the roots. Chopping and dumping remains the simplest way to turn comfrey's power into results. Take a handful of these thick, bristly leaves, cut them off at the base, and place them right at the feet of your tomato, pepper, or berry bushes. No digging, no stirring, just toss in the leaves and go. Over the course of 48 hours, the green pile melts into the soil, releasing a burst of potassium and nitrogen right where fruiting plants need it most. Low fiber content means decomposition is almost instantaneous. No waiting weeks for compost, no worrying about nitrogen lock-in. Every cut, every flush feeds the soil life and roots below without wasting energy. For a liquid boost, there is the infamous comfrey tea. Fill a bucket with fresh leaves, add water, and let it ferment for a week or two. The result is a dark, foul brew stronger than many store-bought fertilizers. The Royal Horticultural Society advises allowing comfrey to flower until April and then cutting it back to encourage fresh leaf growth. This gives the audience a calendar reference for harvest planning. Fermentation longer than 30 days does not increase nutrient content, according to modern tests. A UK permaculture veteran stands among his patch of comfrey, which has had its roots deep in the same soil for over 15 years. Each spring, the plants return unstressed, producing up to 5 heavy harvests per season without chemical intervention. He runs his hand through the thick leaves, remembering the early years when every bag of fertilizer was an expense. Today, he estimates that his small garden saves nearly $2,000 a decade through the comfrey cut-and-dump cycle. In a town 100 miles away, a city gardener fills a bucket with comfrey leaves in preparation for the infamous smell. She grows tomatoes on a concrete balcony, but the routine is simple. Chop up the leaves, toss them around the pots, and let them melt into the soil. For a liquid boost, she ferments comfrey tea that's strong enough to outperform most blue powders at the garden center. Her fertilizer bill has dropped 70%, and her plants show it every season. In a community garden, a soil scientist explains the numbers. Comfrey leaves, used as mulch or tea, contain less than 1/10 of the pyrrolizidine alkaloids found in the roots. Microbes in the soil break them down quickly, and there is no evidence linking comfrey mulch to toxins in crops. Right now, fertilizer prices are reaching record highs while soil health is declining around the world. The World Bank shows that fertilizer prices rose 220% between April 2020 and March 2022. Urea has surpassed 1,022. Urea has surpassed its 2008 peak, creating vulnerabilities for food producers everywhere. The International Energy Agency reports that fertilizers account for about 1.23 gigatons of carbon dioxide equivalent annually. Ammonia production alone accounts for about 1.3% of the energy system's carbon dioxide emissions, figures that give the film a global systems perspective. For modern growers, planting comfrey is not nostalgic. It is a rebellion against instability. It's a choice to feed the soil rather than the supply chain when global demand for sustainable food grows. One plant, buried by fear and convenience, offers a proven path to self-renewing abundance without purchased inputs. Comfrey won't replace all fertilizers everywhere, but it can reduce dependency for gardeners, small gardens, and diversified homesteads. This more modest claim seems more plausible and therefore more likely to spread among skeptical viewers. The question is not whether comfrey can change our future, but whether we will let old stories stop us from planting. Each root cutting carries not only a plant, but also the idea of independence from recurring purchases and price shocks. Lawrence Hill's began with the ambition to feed the world. Now that ambition is compressed to the scale of the viewer. One plot, one bed, one garden, one household less dependent on market fluctuations. This gives the audience a personal next step instead of an abstract rebellion. The philosophy of "we are observers, not believers" guided every experiment of the Henry Doubleday Research Association. Today, the same philosophy can guide anyone who is ready to experience a living alternative to purchased fertility. The old trials, the old cuttings, and the old growers never completely disappeared. They waited for the moment when the world was again ready for a plant that gives everything for free. Balking. 14 offers not only nutrients, but also a lesson that abundance can grow from the earth, not from a factory. In a world of price shocks and climate instability, choosing to plant comfrey becomes an act of faith in living systems. What would you risk to grow freedom from the earth, starting with one deep root in your soil?